I'm Charles Rougé. I'm a lecturer at the University of Sheffield, and maybe I'm going to bring in a slightly different perspective to my career in and maybe also around hydrology, as I focus a lot on hydrological risks, like not only flood but also drought, and focus also a lot on the infrastructure aspect of hydrology, in the sense that I would say an observation that has dominated my career in many ways is that we are in a human-dominated water cycle. So basically, the idea that when we learn in school about the water cycle and all the natural processes, that's the vision that we have, but really it's not complete without looking at how, like, the many ways humans interact with it, and that's not even counting climate change. So here we have, of course, all kinds of water demands, and that are going to interact with the water cycle in many ways. So like reservoirs and river abstractions from rivers and groundwater, etc., and how it modifies land use change, for example, through agriculture, but also land cover change in cities. And that's, of course, a non-exhaustive list. So really, my viewpoint here is from the idea that when we think about hydrology, we think about natural hydrological processes. So kind of like the first slide about the water cycle, and it's of course the physical basis that's still underpins and should underpin hydrological models. But you also have a second layer that is the layer of, let's say, water resource systems, where you maybe focus more on like what is the infrastructure and what are the human controls on it. And a lot of my career actually has been spent on this second layer, but my argument would be that even though, like, to some extent you have two different sets of skills and different viewpoints, there are both about the water cycle, they're both about hydrology. And so they're both, they're both like, they're two viewpoints on, in a way, like similar, like the same object. And that there are two-way impacts between them. So of course, hydrological processes can serve as inputs to water resource systems. Well, how much inflow do you have, etc., how much evaporation, but that increasingly there is scope for having really water resource systems models informing how we view, like because they interact with hydrological processes, informing those. So instead maybe of having like a full maybe linear history of my career, I chose to look maybe at like 3 snapshots of work I have done, especially since my career has been quite multidisciplinary in a way, and that's what I like about looking at water, is like there are a lot of things that lots of different fields and disciplines that come into play around water problems. And so looking at 3 snapshots into like how those two layers, let's say, interact. Really 3 key ideas. The first key idea is, and looking also at the interface of those 2 layers with risk. The first idea is, when you look at risk mitigation and adaptation, you have hydrological impacts that are not always expected, and so like there is a footprint in the hydrological cycle. The second is maybe a kind of classical view that natural processes are going to inform like water resource systems and like risk assessments, even when you have infrastructure. And what I would like to add to that is that can be effective even in really challenging situations, actually. And then the third point would be that conversely, water resource modeling, so having the infrastructure layer, let's say, should inform hydrological modeling, and since it has an difference with the natural processes, it should be included in ways that maybe are not performed today. So I'm going to go through 3 snapshots and stay mostly at high level and present the context and results rather than anything else, especially with the time constraints. So the first is work I did actually in my first research experience as a master's student at the University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign. And I was looking at hydrological change, so in Chicago, Illinois. So Chicago is the 3rd biggest metropolitan area in the US, 12 million inhabitants. And as lots of those like those cities in North America, it has seen a strong suburban growth. So lots of urbanization in the second half of the 20th century. So if you look at the image on the left, really, so you have all the stations, the urban areas are in pink, and it really like expanded in the second half of the 20th century. So when you look at the impact of urbanization and flows, taking out climate variabilities, for example, what do we see? Especially if we compare with the expected effects of land cover change. So first effect of land cover change would be you have on average more water because you have less evapotranspiration, and that's what we see, and that's what was expected. A second effect would be on low flows, that the base flows would be reduced because there is less infiltration and more direct runoff. But contrary to that, we saw a gradual increase in low flows that was widespread in the metropolitan area, both in small scale and larger scale catchments in that area. And even more surprising and coming to flooding is that even like there was no widespread increase in peak flows. There were some areas where you see the expected increases, others where you didn't, even though there are documented increases in the frequency and rainfall. So that would be a very puzzling result. And really what explained those were engineering adaptations. So for the low flows, you look at an increased pressure and supply, the city expands. And what happened was going from groundwater extraction in the city to supply from Lake Michigan. So enabling aquifer replenishment and also, of course, effluent discharge in various points in and around the city. And then a direct response to increased flood costs was offstream reservoirs that have been often at several scales actually effective at mitigating flooding and peak flows. So really, like the consideration earlier in my career that engineering adaptations are going to matter when we look at hydrological impacts beyond what we would expect of, for example, the impact of land cover change and urbanization. And that led me to look really at this second layer of infrastructure. So a second idea is that moving to a second idea, so it's a postdoc I did a few years ago, a challenging risk assessment where I was looking at the Tigris and Euphrates Basin, which is in the Middle East. And if we zoom on that area between Turkey and Syria, we see like a snapshot of what is going on in that basin. As in, so you have, for example, the Euphrates is where you have the blue areas on the map. You have large reservoirs in both Turkey and Syria, and you have also large green areas on the map. So, for example, like with actually large-scale tunnels conveying the water from the reservoirs. But all those green areas are mostly like irrigated areas. So you have large-scale, like large reservoirs, large-scale irrigation, and really the context is the water cycle in that area, in that region, is really like human-dominated, and it puts pressure on water resources because the water used in the end is like 25 times, let's say, the mean flow of the Thames River in London. The annual flow of the Thames River in London. So significant pressure. And so what the project did was to look at, so I was working a project with FAO. And so I was on the flow location part where I was getting data from remote sensing and land data assimilation from Johns Hopkins University in the US. And it was data on flows and evaporation, essentially, to understand what the current situation of the basin is, and actually there was only phase one because what made it challenging is that this conflict in the area. So ISIS happened squarely between the Euphrates and Tigris, and there was no second phase. But what I did is taking this information, building a large-scale infrastructure model on the, like a network model of the basin, and trying to look at what the risks might be. So, for example, if you look at the results in there, which is on the picture I just showed you, like at this border here on the Euphrates, we can see what happens when we go from a probability distribution of natural flows. So here it's really a communication from where, for example, you have a 70% chance of having less than 30 cubic kilometer a year. So dry years on the left, wet years on the right. So you have this probability distribution that if you account for the infrastructure, is going to be shifted to the left. So less water because you have irrigation in Turkey, but also reservoir operation in Turkey. And of course, and then you have also the impact of reservoirs taking water from drier to wet years. But then when you look at vulnerabilities or risk assessment, for example, you can look at a threshold, which is a treaty between the two countries. It's like how much water should go downstream. And since we build actually, let's say a best case model, we still have a pretty low chance of not meeting this threshold, even in the, let's say, current situation. But if we look, what is the chance that we are then like within like 5 cubic kilometers of that, which is at the same time a lot of water, but not that much because it's a region that is drying up, and in theory, at least, developments of irrigation on the Euphrates side in Turkey could account for those extra 5 cubic kilometers alone. And then you have almost a 1 in 2 chance of being below the threshold. So there is a real vulnerability there. And that's a way where you can see how the two layers are needed to have this vulnerability. So of course, I'm not going to go over the full story. And the full story has been published in a couple of years ago in Water Resources Research. I'm going to move on because of time to the third point, which is the other way around, that really the second layer of infrastructure should be maybe modeled in ways that they are currently not, to better inform hydrological models and the risks when hydrological models inform us about risk. So reservoir and hydrological models, well, there are lots of reservoirs around the world, not only developed countries, but also in developing countries. And we want increasingly to monitor water-related risks, we need to account for them as accurately as possible. And these representations have really improved in recent years for many reasons, in many ways. But what is still missing is that there is no coordination signal between the reservoirs, let's say, in the models. And so it's a recent study where it was my last postdoc before arriving in Sheffield. I was at Cornell in the US, and I looked at this part of the Columbia River Basin, so major river in the northwestern US, also in Canada, where you have lots of hydropower, but also irrigation, lots of different uses, also risks, and the infrastructure is used for water supply in droughts and also for flooding. In that area, you have lots of major reservoirs that were developed to really be operated in a coordinated way for flood control and water supply. And have really been deemed successful institutions that can be resilient up to a point to climate change. So if we look at this, really integrated human-natural system, I use the state-of-the-art hydrological model that was previously featured. Previous iterations were featured in Nature of Our Science a few years ago of that model. And really, like other hydrological models, it still has reservoirs as, you have, let's say, storage, etc. And a function of storage and downstream demand, you have a flow. But there is no coordination between reservoirs. And the end result of that is that when you look at historical event of 2011, where there was a lot of snow melt, there was no flooding in the area. But when we look at like how the errors propagate downstream, the last few reservoirs in the valley, really. What we see is we have in black the simulation results, in yellow the historical record, and we go from a really managed high flow event to a really large flood that is simulated. And that is really the result of propagation error for upstream releases. So apologies, you have to believe me on that, but that's really what we saw. And not only that, but simple coordination mechanisms avoid these results, regardless of what other errors we might have in that iteration of the model. And we have same results during dry periods, in that if we don't have coordination, we can lead to emptying the reservoirs completely, and then we have droughts in a way that we don't see in practice. And so that was recently published in S. And with that, since already 16 minutes, I'll go back to my 3 key ideas. And really, I would say the message is maybe similar in the end to what Linda was saying, that hydrology is a big field, in the sense that, looking at the water cycles, there are many ways to look at that. Maybe like mine is more like infrastructure driven, and what are the risks to infrastructure. And there are many ways to contribute, and there are ways to collaborate between different viewpoints. And maybe even better, like a necessity to collaborate between those different viewpoints. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Charles. Thanks ever so much for that really interesting talk, and nice to see I suppose the contrast, or perhaps the diversity within the discipline that is hydrology. We go from flood and flood forecasting through to water resource reservoir modelling. It'd be great if you could unshare your screen, please, Charles.
Oh, sorry. Yes.
Any questions for Charles? We've got again, just an eye on time. We are sort of consistently running just a little late here. But any questions for Charles? And please raise your hands or pop them in the chat if you do have them. The one thing I'll just ask you, Charles, is, and this is perhaps a little bit more around the career aspect, or your career journey. Linda mentioned that she'd moved around a bit in her career, albeit perhaps for maybe slightly different reasons. That's because that's her partner. But I think you've also moved around different countries. Have you found that a challenge, or to some degree, but also have you benefited, do you think, from that moving around?
Yeah, I mean, probably early on, I was finding it quite fun to move around, also I wanted, so I'm from France, but I wanted to see other countries, and not just travel, but also like live in other places, to like, let's say, from my experience when I was younger. And I think it's really been great in that respect, also learning, being in, for example, a few different research groups gives you a better perspective, I think, for example, just from an academic standpoint, but I think it would be same in whatever career, about, for example, what works or doesn't work in terms of like mentoring or management, which comes handy later on. And also, yeah, having like different perspectives, different research environments is great. Of course, at some point, you feel the need to not move around as much, because it becomes a little bit tiring, because you're always like, you get somewhere where you know nobody, and then you get to know the people, etc., make friends, and sometimes more, and then you have to move away. So that's it's good when it stops.
Yeah,